Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Kane never imagined one reckless decision would ignite a chain reaction capable of tearing Genoa City apart, but the moment he slipped that small black USB drive into the inside pocket of his jacket, he felt the weight of 100 lies pressing against his ribs like a warning he chose to ignore, because in his mind, he wasn't stealing. He was rescuing the truth from people who had weaponized it for far too long. Still, even he couldn't anticipate how fast everything would spiral out of control. Or how many lives his choice would rip through, especially Phyllis, who had always danced on the razor's edge of danger but somehow managed to land on her feet every time. Until now. Until the night she muttered those three cryptic words before the police cuffed her wrists and dragged her toward the flashing blue lights that bathed her pale face in a ghostly glow. A moment Kane would replay 1,000 times in his mind because it was the exact second he realized he wasn't the hero of the story. He was the avalanche that buried everyone else. It began at Chancellor Winter's during a late board meeting that dragged past midnight, when the offices were silent except for the hum of the HVAC and the echo of Kane's heartbeat pounding with the impatience of a man who'd been pushed too far, because for weeks he'd suspected that someone was orchestrating chaos behind the scenes, manipulating finances, communications, and internal files with the precision of a puppeteer who knew exactly where everyone's weakest threads were, and when he stumbled across the locked digital folder labeled MW Revisions, he knew it wasn't a coincidence but a secret someone had deliberately buried. He wasn't meant to find it, yet there it was, hidden beneath mislabeled inventory, and when he clicked it, the screen demanded a physical encryption key, the USB meaning someone had the device, someone inside the building or close to it, someone with access and something huge to hide. And suddenly Kane understood that if he didn't act, everything he cared about would crumble, so he searched the restricted storage room, the one barely anyone used, and there he found the USB wedged behind a stack of outdated contracts as if someone had dropped it in a hurry, and without thinking, he pocketed it because the truth belonged to everyone, not just the person who wanted to bury it. But while Kane was convincing himself he had the moral high ground, Phyllis was downstairs at Society, frantically pacing the hallway behind the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear as she hissed. "He can't find it, he can't, do you hear me? If he gets his hands on that drive, all hell breaks loose." Her voice trembling in a way she hadn't allowed it to tremble in years, because for once she wasn't manipulating, she wasn't scheming. She was terrified, truly terrified, and that alone should have been enough to set off alarms in the hearts of anyone who knew her well. But everyone in Genoa City seemed too distracted by their own storms to notice that Phyllis Summers, queen of reinvention, was unraveling. By the time Phyllis arrived at Chancellor Winter's, Kane was already downloading the encrypted files, lines of code scrolling faster than he could read. But the moment she burst into the room, chest heaving, hair wild, hands trembling, he knew she wasn't there to negotiate. She was there to stop him at any cost, and she lunged forward, slamming the laptop shut so violently the sound cracked through the room like a whip, and she begged him in a way that made the air heavy. "Kane, you don't understand. If you open that, people will get hurt." But Kane, fueled by his own sense of betrayal, fired back. "People are already hurt. Whoever's behind this mess has been playing us all, and I'm done letting them win." And with that, he reopened the laptop, ignoring the way Phyllis's entire body seemed to collapse in defeat. Then the door burst open and Chance, unbeknownst to either of them, previously tipped off by an anonymous call, stormed into the room with two uniformed officers behind him shouting, "Nobody move," in that sharp authoritative tone that could freeze blood. And Kane raised his hands instinctively, but Phyllis didn't because she was too fixated on the computer, too desperate to stop the final domino from falling. So when she reached toward the laptop again, one of the officers grabbed her wrist, twisted it behind her back, and in seconds she was cuffed, her red hair falling across her face like a curtain concealing her breaking expression. But her voice came through raw and guttural as she cried out, "You don't get it. You can't let him open it." Yet Chance wasn't listening. He was too focused on Kane, demanding if the USB was his, demanding to know why Phyllis was so desperate, demanding answers Kane didn't have yet. As they escorted Phyllis toward the hallway, she suddenly stopped resisting, straightened her spine and locked eyes with Kane, and for the first time that night, her voice settled into a chilling calm as she uttered those three words that would haunt him forever. "You doomed everyone." The officers tugged her forward, but Kane couldn't breathe. Those words sliced into him like glass, echoing in his skull as if they carried some prophecy he had no way of understanding. After Phyllis disappeared around the corner, Chance questioned Kane for nearly an hour, demanding context, but Kane, unable to explain without revealing that he'd stolen the USB, said only that he found it abandoned and wanted to know what was on it. And though Chance didn't fully buy it, he allowed Kane to leave. After confiscating both the drive and the laptop, Kane walked out of the building feeling the night air press against his face like ice, replaying Phyllis's voice, "You doomed everyone," over and over until he nearly convinced himself he'd misheard. But deep down he knew he hadn't, because Phyllis didn't say things she didn't mean, especially not when she was frightened. Meanwhile, in the back seat of the police car, Phyllis stared out the window, watching the blur of Genoa city lights streak by. Her eyes burning with unshed tears as she whispered to herself that Kane had no idea what he'd unleashed. No idea that the USB wasn't just evidence. It was a map, a roadmap to a network of covert deals, falsified identities, financial cover-ups, and one secret so explosive it could destroy reputations, relationships, and at least 2 powerful families, a secret she had been trying to dismantle quietly before it detonated. But Kane, in his determined naivety, had ripped the pin from the grenade. Back at Society, news spread fast, and within an hour, Jack, Diane, Christine, and Summer learned Phyllis had been arrested, each reacting in their own emotional languages. Summer dissolving into tears, Christine stiffening with old bitterness resurfacing, Jack rubbing his temples as frustration choked his patience, and Diane watching with wide eyes, calculating and fearful, because any time Phyllis was in trouble, Diane knew her own name could be dragged through whatever fire was burning. Summer demanded to know the charges, demanded answers the officers couldn't give, demanded to speak to her mother, but Chance kept repeating that they needed to review the evidence first, which only fueled Summer's panic. When Kane finally arrived at Society hoping for answers himself, Summer stormed up to him, shoving him hard enough he stumbled, screaming, "What did you do to her?" But Kane, still in shock, could barely form words, only repeating that Phyllis had been trying to stop him from opening the files, and those words only made everyone more suspicious, because why would Phyllis care what was on a stolen USB unless she had something to hide? Summer insisted her mother wasn't involved in anything illegal, but Jack exchanged a wary glance with Diane because with Phyllis, innocence was always a moving target. Later at the police station, Chance sat alone in the interrogation room staring at the USB on the table, debating whether to plug it in now or wait for a tech specialist, but every instinct in him whispered that whatever was on it was dangerous, not just in the criminal sense, but in the way that could fracture families, upend companies, and trigger legal wars that might never end. As he reached for the drive, Phyllis, sitting in a holding cell mere rooms away, closed her eyes and whispered the same 3 words to herself, "You doomed everyone." Because she knew once the truth came out, nothing in Genoa City would ever be the same again, and Kane, still pacing outside Society with shaking hands, realized that for the first time in his life, he might have crossed a line he couldn't undo, a line that didn't just risk his own future but the futures of everyone entangled in the web he had just torn open. And as dawn crept over Genoa City, casting soft light over hard truths, Kane finally understood that he hadn't just stolen a USB. He had stolen the last seconds before an explosion, and now all he could do was wait for the blast. Kane stood there in front of Society, the morning sun starting to spill across the pavement, but instead of warmth, he felt cold all the way down to his bones, as if Phyllis's warning had frozen something deep inside him that he couldn't thaw no matter how many times he tried to tell himself that he had done the right thing, that uncovering the truth was always the moral path, that secrets only festered when left in the dark. Yet even as he tried to cling to those justifications, every passing second made him feel less like a crusader and more like a fool stumbling into a labyrinth he didn't understand. And meanwhile, inside the police station, Phyllis sat alone at the small metal table in the interrogation room, staring down at her shaking hands, realizing how everything she had fought so desperately to control had slipped through her fingers in a single night, because the truth about the USB, its origin, its owner, and its catastrophic implications, had been meant to stay buried, until she found a way to dismantle the threat quietly, methodically, and without casualties. But now that Kane had touched it, downloaded from it, and forced Chance to seize it as evidence, she knew the unraveling had begun, and once the unraveling starts, it never stops until every thread is exposed, tangled, or cut. She leaned back in her chair, staring up at the fluorescent light, blinking rapidly as she tried not to break, because she couldn't afford to break. Not now, not when every move she made from this moment on would decide whether she was destroyed, redeemed, or something far more complicated. At the same time, Summer sat outside the interrogation room, pacing furiously, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white, because every attempt she made to reach Michael Baldwin went to voicemail, and every second wasted made her panic grow, especially knowing that Chance had the USB and that Cain Ashby of all people, had somehow inserted himself into the epicenter of her mother's newest crisis, and Summer didn't know whether to scream or collapse or hunt Cain down herself. But before she could spiral deeper, Jack approached her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her breathing, telling her they would figure everything out, but she brushed him off, snapping that he didn't understand, that nobody understood, that her mother wasn't the monster everyone loved painting her as, especially Diane, whom Summer glanced at with pure accusation, though Diane remained silent, knowing saying anything would ignite a war she wasn't prepared to fight before breakfast. Meanwhile, Chance had moved from the interrogation wing to a secure tech room, where he placed the USB on a tray beside a laptop already fitted with forensic software, and he felt that same prickling at the back of his neck that he always felt when a case was bigger than anyone realized, the kind of instinct he had developed not as a cop but as a man who had seen the ugly side of human secrets during his military and FBI days, and he understood the critical difference between a normal case and a minefield. This USB was a minefield, one that could obliterate people he cared about or people who were in too deep to save. And while Chance hovered between caution and urgency, Cain finally left society and drove aimlessly, ending up at the Chancellor Mansion without even realizing how he'd gotten there. But being there reminded him of Jill, of Devon, of Lily, and of all the lives he could destroy if Phyllis's ominous declaration turned out to be prophetic, and his hands shook as he sat in the driveway, staring at the house, wondering whether he should confess to someone, anyone, that he had taken the USB, triggered Phyllis's arrest, and possibly unleashed something far darker than simple corporate sabotage. However, Cain knew that the moment he told one person, the floodgates would open, and once the floodgates opened, control would be lost entirely. So he swallowed the confession, shoved his trembling hands under his legs, and told himself he needed answers before he spoke. He needed to know exactly what he'd stolen and why Phyllis had been so desperate to keep it hidden. Back at the station, Chance finally inserted the USB into the forensic laptop, and the screen flickered as encrypted partitions appeared. 5 of them, all heavily protected with high-level security systems uncommon for the average schemer, which meant the drive had either been built by someone with government-level skills or stolen from someone who had access to that caliber of technology, and either possibility sent a chill down Chance's spine. He began running a decryption scan, but before it could even progress 2%, the screen flashed red and a warning popped up. Attempted breach detected. Authorization required. Unauthorized access will initiate automatic purge. Chance cursed under his breath, not loudly but enough to signal that whatever he had in his hands wasn't some petty company secret. It was more dangerous, more protected, more intentionally hidden, and he immediately stopped the scan, unplugged the drive, and placed it back on the tray with a buzzing feeling in his chest that he needed to handle this carefully, because breaching something like this without understanding its origin could trigger consequences far beyond Genoa City. Meanwhile, Phyllis, still in the interrogation room, suddenly sat forward, her instincts firing at full capacity, knowing in her bones that Chance was trying to access the drive, and her heart hammered against her ribs because she knew what would happen if he pushed the wrong button or triggered the wrong defense mechanism. Not because the files would simply erase themselves but because the owner, the person behind all of this, would be alerted, and that person was far more dangerous than anyone in the GC rumor mill could imagine. As Phyllis wrestled with her rising panic, Christine entered the room, arms folded, expression unreadable, asking Phyllis what she had gotten herself into this time. But Phyllis didn't rise to the bait, didn't snap back with sarcasm, didn't lash out. She simply stared at Christine with a hollow intensity and said, "This isn't about me. It's about something much bigger." And Christine, unprepared for such honesty, hesitated for a fraction of a second, giving Phyllis just enough time to add, "You need to stop Chance from opening that drive." But Christine scoffed, saying that the only way she'd consider anything Phyllis said was if Phyllis told the truth about why she had been hiding it in the first place. But Phyllis remained silent, because telling the truth wasn't an option, not yet. Back outside, Summer was near tears, Jack struggling to keep her calm, Diane staying quiet but wary, and Billy arriving in a whirlwind of anger after hearing Cain's name connected to the situation, because Billy knew better than most, that when Kane got involved in anything involving stolen evidence, chaos always followed, and he demanded answers from Jack, from Summer, from anyone who would listen, but none of them had any answers to give. Meanwhile, Kane returned to Chancellor Winters, driven by a desperate need to undo what he'd done. But when he arrived, he found Devon and Lily already there, both of them furious and confused after receiving early morning calls about police seizing electronic property and demanding access to servers, and Devon rounded on Kane the moment he walked through the door, demanding to know why the police were involved, why Chance had taken equipment, and what Kane had gotten the company into. But Kane, instead of defending himself, simply whispered, "I think I made a mistake." And the moment those words left his mouth, he felt the full weight of them crash down like a building collapsing. Devon demanded clarity, raising his voice, but Kane couldn't explain, not without revealing everything, not without risking even more damage, so he only managed, "It's complicated." Which infuriated Lily, who snapped that complicated wasn't good enough. Not when their company was at risk, not when Kane had a history of letting impulsive decisions snowball into disasters that others had to clean up. As tensions escalated at Chancellor Winters, Chance returned to the interrogation area and ordered that Phyllis be brought back to questioning. But when she sat down across from him, she saw immediately in his eyes that he had tried to access the drive, and she leaned forward urgently, voice trembling with real fear as she whispered, "Tell me you didn't try to open it." But Chance didn't confirm nor deny it, instead demanding, "Who does that drive belong to? And what exactly am I dealing with?" But Phyllis couldn't bring herself to answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she feared that once she spoke the name, once she identified the true mastermind, she would be signing both her own death sentence and possibly Kane's, Summer's, Jack's, Diane's, and half the people in Genoa City who had unknowingly crossed the wrong person. She swallowed hard, lowering her gaze, then quietly repeated the same words Kane couldn't escape. "You don't understand." But Chance slammed his hand on the table, demanding she stop speaking in riddles and start telling the truth, because if she didn't, he would be forced to move forward with charges that would make this situation far worse. But Phyllis simply stared back, eyes reflecting a kind of resignation Chance had never seen in her before. Meanwhile, the screen of the confiscated forensic laptop lit up again, not because anyone touched it, but because a new prompt appeared. External trace detected. Monitoring initiated. And though Chance wasn't there to see it, the message was unmistakable. Someone else, someone miles away, someone powerful, someone watching, had just realized their secret drive was in police custody, and far from the station, in a luxury penthouse belonging to a figure rarely spoken of but deeply connected to the darkest corners of GC's past. A phone lit up with a notification, and the man who lifted it slowly from the table smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the cold smile of someone who had built an empire out of other people's mistakes, and he whispered, "So it begins," before standing and retrieving his coat, ready to return to Genoa City and reclaim what belonged to him, leaving behind a chilling certainty that Phyllis had been right. Kane didn't just doom everyone. He had awakened a storm no one was prepared to face. Back at the police station, the tension thickened like smoke as Chance returned to the tech room and saw that unsettling message glowing on the laptop screen. The words "external trace detected," pulsing like a heartbeat from someone watching through the shadows, and he felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that this case no longer belonged solely to Genoa City law enforcement, but had drawn the attention of a far more sophisticated and dangerous entity, one that operated with precision and purpose. He slammed the laptop shut, his jaw tight, his instincts screaming at him that he needed to keep a lid on every detail before panic spread. But even as he lifted the USB to secure it in an evidence locker, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already too late, that someone out there had just been alerted and was already planning their next move. And meanwhile Phyllis sat in silence in her holding cell, gripping the edge of the cold metal bench as dread twisted her insides, because she knew exactly what that external trace meant. He knew, the man behind the USB, the man she'd been trying to outrun, outmaneuver, outsmart for months, the man who didn't forgive betrayal and certainly didn't tolerate interference. Across town, Summer and Jack finally convinced Christine to let them speak to Phyllis for just a moment. But when Summer rushed into the visiting area, tears streaking her cheeks, pleading, "Mom, just tell them what's going on," Phyllis could only shake her head, forcing her voice to remain steady as she said, "Sweetheart, you have to trust me. Saying anything right now would put you in danger." And the seriousness in her mother's tone made Summer freeze, The kind of fear she'd only heard from Phyllis when the threat was truly, undeniably real. At Chancellor Winter's, Kane sat alone in Devon's office after being removed from the servers, and the weight of what he'd triggered crushed down on him harder with every passing minute until he finally buried his face in his hands, whispering to himself, "What did I do?" replaying Phyllis's warning, Chance's suspicion, and the chilling message Chance refused to discuss with him. And far away, the mysterious man stepped off a private plane onto the GC airstrip, adjusting his jacket with a calmness that contrasted sharply with the chaos brewing in town, and as he walked toward his waiting car, he murmured the same 3 words Phyllis had spoken before being dragged away, except his carried a promise rather than a warning. "They'll pay dearly."